We're going to shift, well, not shift gears, but we're going to focus now on the shaped canvases, the gifts to the universe. And again, just to remind people, it was a fairly large series. It spanned from 83 to 89. And the first part of the series were more square and rectangular, and then you had migrated to the shaped canvases, which are more expressive and what have you. And in the writing that I had done, I sort of referred to these as sort of celebratory, exuberant, they're sort of wild and kind of out there. And it was because, in your opinion, based on our talks, that this was a breakthrough moment for you, following the Convergence and Emergence. And you had said something, and those two series were actually the subject of the previous exhibition. And in the Convergence series, they're square, large squares with pores. And we've mentioned the pores already as they cycled back in your work in between the still point and the disk, the single, isolated disk that we had talked about earlier. And they were, back at that point, you were needing something to ground you after coming out of this turbulent time in your life with addiction and a number of psychological issues and personal issues. So you needed a grounding, and they were solid paintings, even though they were kind of ethereal with the pour and what have you, and they had this opening, but made them very abstract and very interesting. But yet still, they were quadrants, they were structured paintings. And then the Emergence were a little bit more exuberant and more expressive because they too had like a cross structure, still maintained sort of this bisecting your square into quadrants, but much more, I wouldn't say lyrically, but they were poured and
it
much
was almost
more
a
gestural.
bioorganic kind of gestation that you see happening caught.
And then, as you said, they progressed, and then to these coming out of sort of your readings on cosmology and psychology and just your interest in Eastern religions and higher consciousness. And so that's where these came from. And in these pictures, I think they have a little bit of a street art feeling to them, a little graffiti-ish, because it's sort of seemingly disparate and unrelated, sort of subject matter layered upon layered, and that has this feel of a person making a mark and then another person responding to the mark and another person responding to that mark. And I want you'll explain it for us in a second here, why the quadrilaterals, why the spray paint, why these, and this is really sort of what the Emergence paintings sort of look like. So, and again, it's not rigid and structured at all, but you still did keep this grounding, and this sort of allowed you to burst out of that, where it was a lot more exuberant and you had a lot more things going on. And you'll explain why, but so this was a real breakthrough moment for you, as we'd said. So talk about then I wanted to finish my thought about the sort of street stuff. So what struck me was when you talked about these diverse interests in astrophysics and cosmology and and psychology, in many ways those are like different beings. They're like different people laying down marks. And I kind of came to that based on what you said each of these sort of marks mean categorically. So that's what I'd like you to start with, is what are these categorical distinctions in your mind, where they come from, because it's very important and very interesting. And then how this created this breakthrough into meditation, because these were not derived out of meditation. These were derived out of more science and technical and sort of this creative journey you put yourself on as you moved away from, because you were much more of a figurative painter, a representational painter. So you really were sort of feeling your way through in the late 70s and early 80s into abstraction. And so that's where I'd like to, that's sort of the background. And so what I'd like for you to do now is sort of talk more about the individual marks, what they mean, and they relate back to your historical sort of progression, but how they open the door to what ultimately led to these discs. And that's what we want to convey for people, sort of this isn't completely random. You know, these aren't random series that you do inspired by one thing 1 week or month or year and inspired by another at some other point in time. It really is a continuum. You see this all as a continuum. So take it away.
Yeah. So there are several parts to that. Let me answer the first about the street art and the layering. It's a very interesting connection. These were done in the 80s, and street art was like all over the place in the 80s. I didn't necessarily, I didn't necessarily, my inspiration didn't come from that.
No, I understood.
Yeah, I know. But there's a similarity in the actual process of seeing writing, graffiti, and then someone writing over it and someone writing over that, because they're different personalities and they're doing different things, and you're seeing through that to a complex space. So that's the similarity. And you know, you're part of a time. So, you know, I can't just say, oh, that has nothing to do with what I was doing, because I was looking at that stuff.
Yeah, and it's not like you were directly influenced, but it's subliminal. It's all around you.
Absolutely.
You know, so you cannot not see it, and especially if you're an observant person and an artist who you scan and look and observe everything.
You know, I go into a restaurant and I see terrible art. I look at it and I love it and I think about it. You know, and like all the rest of the people in the restaurant,
it's like you cannot not look at it.
Exactly, and nobody else is paying any attention to it.
Yeah.
But you know, so
yeah.
You know, it's part of the joys of being a visual person.
Yeah.
So the layering and the individual layers, they can be approached in with two very different perspectives, or maybe even three. The first is science-oriented, and reading a lot about Einsteinian understanding of the time-space continuum, and the fact that the geometric space, the three axes geometric space, became 4 axes with time as part of the understanding of the universe, and how the Newtonian sense of a kind of a given space, and there's an anchoredness, Einstein destroys, so there's no ground. So everything is in relationship to everything else. So the quadrilaterals are done with multiple perspective points going in different directions. And that was directly related to my mind in wrapping around that sense of space. And also, I know something very interesting about them. The poor, you can't help but intuitively understand that it's creating a sense of time, because you sense the fact that it's poured, and it's poured with a continuity, and you're kind of experiencing that when you're looking at it. You're recreating that. The spray is an entirely different sense of time, but it's kind of like skywriting, you know, with an airplane. So there's a sense of that kind of time. And the quadrilaterals, you know, one of the movies that has most influenced me visually is 2001. And the sense of ballet of space that's in that film, I think, which I saw in 1968, that sense that the quadrilaterals kind of dance and sculpt the space and move you in different directions, that's also a different kind of time. So you have these multiple times that you're getting a gestalt from. And I think what happens is if the paintings work, you get this coherence, subconscious coherence when you're looking at the image, but it's a very, very complex and dynamic coherence of parts that are separately very different. This painting, I hadn't looked at in years and years and years, and recreating in my mind how I painted it. It's like 5 or 6 different layers of image, and none of them are done where you could go over and redo something. So when I was painting these pictures, it was like I knew that it was like building a piece of furniture. Step A, step B, step C, and if it worked, it worked, and if it didn't, it didn't. And I'd say 90% of the time, if not more, I was very satisfied with what happened. And the other thing about all these Gift to the Universe paintings is that even though I was using a developing visual vocabulary that's similar from one image to the next, each one was an entirely different emotional, psychological, visual journey. And I think journey is a very good word. So talking about them psychologically, I think there was this sense of looking at them and feeling, this sense of a cosmic kind of consciousness. This, again, science fiction, but emotive consciousness in them, which was one way of seeing it. And then conversely, they're like an inner journey, psychologically.
Okay.
So there's that. And I'm trying to think if there was a third.
Well, if I'm looking a little befuddled at you, throwing you off, it's because I sort of feel like a trial attorney where my witness is just completely gone off script, and what you're saying bears no relationship to our pretrial prep. And so, so the time thing, and in all the conversations, and we've had hundreds of them about this, the time thing is sort of a new element to me. So that's what sort of threw me. So let me maybe help get you back to where because one of the things you had said to me, which and maybe you were just distilling it down for me, but these areas here you refer to as pores. Mm-hmm. You thought of them more as materiality.
Yes.
And
yes.
Their opacity obviously sort of lends itself to that, but they also are probably the things that sort of looks like they're trying to morph into something, or maybe they were an explosion coming out of something. Mm-hmm. The other thing were the sprays were, this ethereal sort of sprays, were more spirituality, where you sort of have this sort of veil that you're looking through the painting at, like it was the last thing applied, or the thing that's most heavily coloring how you look at these paintings. Mm-hmm. And then these quadrilaterals, which I thought was sort of interesting, the way you sort of initially had thought, because they tend to be sort of telescoping in a plane, but you had said that there are no straight lines though in space, which is, I mean, in nature,
right.
Which is sort of interesting because they are sort of straight lines. They are the things that were most rigid. So that was sort of,
yeah, that represents
what I was expecting. The time thing is fine. It just it threw me off. Like I said, it bared no resemblance to our pretrial prep, And so, but that's fine. But when I look at it now, when you talk about time and you keep talking about these as sort of a cosmic explosion, having now heard this, it kind of makes me think of it in a couple different ways. Because one is, these have always struck me as very trippy, and which is my immediate attraction to them. And there's sort of psychedelia, a little bit of a psychedelia going on. And why I think that is because when we think of like things like, psychedelia, and we think about the posters from,
I love that art.
With Fillmore West.
I just love that art.
And the Winterland. What you see is that combination of there's surrealism, these things that are not grounded, which is funny you said that because you mentioned Einstein. But also you see these things that are very optical and very trippy, which sort of trigger your eye to be more suggestive to the power of suggestion anyway. Well, not your eye, but your eye seeing them is kind of making your mind, see things maybe something that's more spatial that really isn't there. It's flat, but you're seeing it in a very illusory sort of way. And then also, there's just that whole thing with like Madras plaid, plaid on plaid. So there's a lot of dense information in psychedelia because a lot of it's coming out of memory, most of it you're not really seeing, and so it is all very illusory and trippy. But anyway, so that's how these initially struck me. But the other thing too, though, is that these do have a spatial aspect about them. And part of it is because they are distinct imagery these are literally overlaying on one another. And so, but at the same time, they're very illusory because what really triggers that is these quadrilaterals because they are telescoping. So it inherently, even though they're completely flat color, you're not modeling them. It's just that torquing and twisting that this seems like a planar piece of metal that's sort of bending in space. And so it immediately gets your mind thinking there's something going on here, and you see this in a different way, which then makes this when you talked about space, this is like almost like in the because cosmology is a big part of what inspires you, so yeah, there's all these structured things in time and in space, but they also blow up, and so you have comets and stars
reading
exploding.
About supernovas.
So in a way, this is sort of like it's a little bit more astral, perhaps, but just a lot of events over time kind of compacted into this, which again, with it being a shaped canvas, then there is no real reference point here. I mean, it can be really, really big. It could be, just a snippet of something or whatever. And so I think that's kind of the interesting thing about these to me is that because they're not how we think about shaped canvas, as I explained to you the other day, in a traditional sense when artists who were looking at shaped canvases and thinking about painting and painting per se. Because the interior, like these quadrilaterals, don't really bear a strong relationship to the sides. They don't come out of it. So it's not like, and you mentioned Mocha Leger's work, which you love, because you constantly come back to her work and stuff, because they're very stunning. They're very simple. Well, not simple, but very reductive and clean, because it's really focused on color. But it's her color relationships, because she's a color theorist, that you get this interplay between color, so it excites your eye and your mind, and you see these things as potentially, and also the fact that it's vector geometry and spatial geometry, and so they're really simple. But what happens is things that are happening in the interior sort of morph out into to the exterior, and so that's what makes really great, successful, shaped canvases. When you're relying on something that's just the color and just the shape, and it conveys all this. The other person is Leo Viador, was a master at this. Very minimal, reductive, but he really gave this illusion of this scale and space. But again, it's because there was always he created this internal tension, just like Mocha does. And it's just the way they think. It's just their mind, the way these things come together, and it's really fascinating. But so what you've done is you've brought that in, because now it does it. You did it sort of in the inverse. The shapes and the fact that it's not 4 sides, it's 5. Sometimes it's 4. But the fact that they're not normal, they're not all 90-degree angles, it makes you look at these now and the imagery in the inside very differently. And to me, they seem like more cohesive compositions than the square ones, oddly. Because the square ones look like, to me, when I look at them, I like them because I love the wild color and everything. But what it looks like is there's this whole thing going on that's huge, and you just cut out 60 inches by 60 inches, and it's just a snippet, and you're like going, well, where's the rest of it, you know? But these, oddly, to me, when I look at them, look like very complete compositions. There's not really a big mystery because there's enough of these different elements all together that interact and have this dialogue. It's not like there's something else missing, you know? And so I don't know, it's really kind of interesting how just that subtle difference between a square to a non-square and also not traditional four-sided shape really kind of throws you off. I mean, it really opens your mind to a lot of suggestion.
You know, I'm reading
and
about
maybe I'm way over-interpreting
No,
these.
I don't think, no, I think it's, I think you're raising an interesting point about there's a...
I try.
I could talk for hours with you about this. Degas' compositions. I'm reading about the Impressionists now. And it strikes me that Degas is the most intellectually rigorous of the Impressionists, and his spatial adventure with skewing the narrative and having lots of empty space or having something just cut off is I think direct. He wasn't who I was thinking of, but you know, in terms of art history, he's the one who I would place as being someone who you could focus on to come to see that and have a kind of a connection to.
Yeah, because he always had a lot of asymmetry. I'm just thinking of even just the ballerinas.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, there was the scale relative to the painting, the location within the painting, and sometimes, am I not mistaken, sometimes you just got like a toe or a bit of a tutu off to an edge, and knowing that there was another person there, but you don't see the whole person, there's enough of a referent that you got the idea that we're looking at this void between two people.
And they're extraordinarily radical in that. I mean, nobody was doing anything like that at all. That came full grown out of him.
Well, I'm glad you bridged that, because when you said Degas, I'm like, oh my goodness, here we go again. No pre-trial prep on this one.
So getting back to your sense of the straight lines.
Yes.
That to me is symbolic of being man-made.
Yes, okay, that makes sense.
And that represented to me in terms of like an internal voyage, ideas, because we have ideas, and so the
creativity, that was another aspect of these that you felt like was also a breakthrough for you. And as we've already said, that's really what you were on this short journey between the late 70s to this beginning of these. You covered a lot of ground in terms of abstraction and sort of things you were playing with and working with and so these were like explosive when you did these.
And these specifically, I wanted to deal with information density. With with
that gets
all
back
of
to your thoughts of Pollock.
With all of my my reading, and I wanted these to be. I remember thinking, walking down a New York street, there's just so much information going on, and I wanted that kind of experience of information density to be reflected in these paintings.
Well, these are definitely the most information dense. To some extent, the series between here and into the memories, right?
Into the mystery.
Into the mystery. Were more narrative.
Yes.
And you picked one thing, which was sort of the pour, that kind of, and the disc, because they were so strikingly different, a disc and then this pour, that it create this, inherently there's this mystery, or not mystery, but this, you feel like there's a story there. And especially when you did them asymmetrically and had just, instead of two discs with the central pour, and they were very symmetrical, you started playing with the disc and different relationships, so it begs the question, what's that all about? And then the other thing, then you went with a single pour and a disc, just like 2/3 of a painting. And so, and also the fact that they were horizontal just immediately makes you think of a landscape, a story, something narrative. So anyway, it was, you have played with different things, but nothing has been as data dense as this.
No,
those
absolutely.
other paintings, my point was, is that they were dated, well, they're dense in that the narrative is complex. And, but the imagery isn't so complex.
Yeah.
So you sort of move from a lot happening visually and a lot happening mentally to very quickly you flip from this to a lot happening still mentally, but visually it got cleaned up really quickly. And what you started playing with then, and maybe this is actually something else you ought to think about, is why did you start moving those things around and doing only 2/3 of it, not all of it? That's very Degas in terms of what you just described. It was playing now with the voids. And so anyway, I think that's kind of interesting because I hadn't even thought about that. So you guys just captured, we had another breakthrough, you know, where seriously, I mean, that's what I like about these talks and keeping them not overly structured because, you know, this opened up like a whole different discussion we've never had about this work.
Right.
Which is astounding given that, you know, how's it doing over these last 2 years, how we not covered this ground. But anyway, that's interesting to think about because, and that's what makes, I think, these even more profound because now your process is, there's a complexity about your process that we've never really unpacked.
There's a visual crystallization.
Yeah, but this is a simple representation of it, but there's a lot of complexity and depth behind it. So these aren't as simple and graphic looking as they seem at first glance.
You know, I love Milton Avery's late paintings. There's such a simplification and purification of mark and a lightness to them that can only happen after you've been working for decades and decades and decades, and you understand what you're doing in such a way that when you put a mark down, it has all of those years with it. And I think these have that for me. You know, whether other people see it is, I can't say, but for me, they really have these 30 years of meditation, 40 years of making abstract painting continuously. They're a very, very complete meal visually for me. What I wanted to get back with these, though, is we didn't talk about the art references. And I think
that's odd for me, but go ahead.
they're crucial. The color comes out of when I was 16 and first went to MoMA, I saw the Matisse, Derain, and Vlaminck Fauve paintings and just immediately opened up to them. I love the physicality of the paint. I love the color. And it was, and Matisse became somebody who was a real touchstone. So these paintings, I arrogantly wanted to out Matisse. You know, they were a sense of, you know, let me play with color as best I can. The clusters of trapezoids came from, in a way, looking very, very hard at Picasso and Braque's analytical cubism, which took me a decade of real hard looking before I finally had an aha moment with.
Had a what with it?
An aha moment. You know, where I could never see them, but like finally I had a breakthrough. And the kind of things that the space in those analytical cubism paintings have, that this is the quadrilaterals playing in space is my riff on that. And then the key to these paintings is Pollock. Absolute essential key. Number one, I won number 31, 1950 at MoMA, is a painting that I go back to all the time. and always find more and more and more and more profound. And as we spoke, I read an essay by Thomas Crow in which he makes a very interesting observation about those poor paintings, in that there's the very small incidents in the painting, and then there's the very large, but there's nothing in the middle. And
in terms of scale.
In terms of scale, yeah. And I think Pollock's Out of the Web was him trying to deal with that specific issue. It's a one-off, and as much as I like it, if I had to choose one to live with, it wouldn't be Out of the Web. But these paintings were about peeling back that space and filling it with the middle. So that's a reflection of Pollock being so generative to me, and he still is. And I think his big breakthrough was when he got rid of the middle. That just, that gave him everything that he created that was monumental. Mm-hmm. These are about all of the insides of that. And there's a poetic, psychological experience in them, and a real mystery. I think Pollock, you get this sense in that painting of like a ground of being, a kind of kinetic energy that's at the base of everything. These have a kind of purposefully intellectual, cognitive aspect to them that those paintings don't have. So maybe that's my addition to the Pollock space.
So the next thing I want us to cover is sort of the more contemporary cultural aspects that influence you. We've made reference to the RBG painting, and also people have probably been seeing this text on the walls. So when we move to this other painting, let's talk about the text on the walls and the genesis of that, and talk about these more contemporary influences on these paintings. So we've covered, why both series are breakthroughs and how they're sort of related. The bridging is clearly the meditation and how you've evolved in that, and feel like you've come to a breakthrough with these more reductive central disc, and which really represents more of a spiritual, a continued and more profound spiritual awakening, hence the name of the show. We've also talked about the art historical sort of influences and, in both series, and there's quite a range, which is not surprising. And next now, what we'd like to do is kind of go to sort of what is now in the contemporary space that propels you to do some of these pictures, and that'll be sort of our wrap up.